Welcome to GED Mastery. Let's talk about independent versus dependent variables. So what is an independent variable? An independent variable is what you change in an experiment, and a dependent variable is what changes as a result of your change. I also like to think of these as cause and effect. We'll see these in some practice problems. But first, let's talk about variables and graphs. It's harder to remember how to identify the independent and dependent variables in a graph, but here's a trick. If you hold your hand up next to the graph so that your fingers are pointing upward as if they were the vertical axis, and your thumb is pointing out to the side as if it's the horizontal axis, your thumb is independent of your four other fingers, so your thumb represents the independent variable and your fingers represent the dependent variable. We'll see this in a question toward the end of the video, but first, let's do a practice question together. So the first step is to identify the change that's being made. Calcium supplements are believed to reduce bone thinning. An experiment was created to give different groups of people differing dosages of calcium over an extended time. What are the independent and dependent variables of the experiment? So what is the thing that they're changing? Well, they're giving different groups of people different dosages of calcium. So that's the independent variable, the differing dosages of calcium. Let's look at the dependent variable. As a result of the independent variable, as the result of the different dosages of calcium, what is the effect? They're hypothesizing that it will reduce bone thinning. So the amount of bone thinning would then be the dependent variable, because the amount of bone thinning depends, they're hypothesizing, on the differing dosages of calcium. So here we have the dependent variable and the independent variable. Let's take a look at a practice problem. Pause the video if you want to try it on your own first. You wonder if balls that are bigger bounce higher. You decide to run an experiment. You gather balls of 5 different sizes, all made of the same material, and bounce them with the same amount of force. You measure the height that each ball bounced and compare the data. What is the dependent variable? So let's remember that the dependent variable depends on the independent variable. So first, the independent variable, the thing that you're changing, is the ball size. So the ball size would be the independent variable. And what's the result of that change? Well, we're thinking that it would change the height. So the dependent variable would be the height of the bounce. Let's do another practice. A scientist hypothesized that tree leaves were larger if they got less sunlight. She collected data to test her hypothesis. She measured the average amount of sunlight hitting 100 different leaves on the same tree and compared that to the size of each leaf. She repeated the data collection with different types of trees. What is the independent variable? Here, this experiment is a little bit different because the scientist isn't actually introducing a change. She's just studying a phenomenon. You could also look at the hypothesis to find the independent variable, because if you have an if-then statement, if one thing happens, then another will happen. The if part will be the independent variable, and the then part will be the dependent variable. We do have a hypothesis here. So if they got less sunlight, the tree leaves would be larger. So we have our if part right here, and that would be the independent variable. So the amount of sunlight affects the size of the leaves. So our answer is going to be B. Let's do another practice. A research project had the following hypothesis. If a car is washed and not dried on a cloudy day, it will have fewer water spots than a car that is washed and not dried on a sunny day. What is the dependent variable? So let's remember that the dependent variable depends on the independent variable, and the independent variable is what you're changing. They're changing whether it's cloudy or sunny, and the amount of water spots will depend on whether it's cloudy or sunny, in theory. So the type of car is actually a constant. We're going to assume that you're going to use the same type of car for each trial so that you're keeping some things the same. And not being dried is also a constant. You're not drying the car in either condition. You're not drying it on the cloudy day and you're not drying it on the sunny day. The amount of water spots is the dependent variable, and that depends on the amount of cloud cover. So that is going to be our answer. Let's do another practice. This one has a graph. Yvette made a graph of ticket prices for rock concerts and the number of people attending those concerts. What is the dependent variable? Well, here we have a graph. We could do the hand trick again, right? So if you put your hand up on the graph so that your fingers are facing upward and your thumb is facing to the right horizontally, your thumb is independent of those other fingers, so that's the independent variable, and your fingers pointing upward are the dependent variable. So the dependent variable is right here, the number of concert attendees. So there we have it. And I guess there's assuming that if you change the ticket price, it will affect the number of people who go to that concert. Look at how long this passage is. It actually comes from the GED.com website. If you do a Google search for GED Science Study Guide, it should be the first result that comes up. And I've actually significantly cut it down from what it is on that study guide. But it's a good example of having a lot more information than you actually need to answer the question. So our question here is asking about the independent and dependent variables, so let's read with that in mind. Dissolved carbon dioxide gas, CO2, creates carbonic acid in ocean water. Rising ocean acidity levels may harm marine life by causing hearing loss. Scientists investigated the effect of increased acidity on fish hearing. A group of fertilized fish eggs from the same parents were divided into 4 different aquariums, each with a different pressure of carbon dioxide. The eggs hatched and the fish lived in these aquariums until testing. For the experiment, one fish was placed into an aquarium containing the same CO2 pressure in which it was raised. The fish's position was recorded every 5 seconds for 2 minutes. Then, sounds from a predatory fish were played from an underwater speaker at one end of the aquarium at a volume that was only audible to the fish when swimming near the speaker. The fish's position was again recorded every 5 seconds for 2 minutes. Trials were repeated with fish from each tank. The study showed that fish raised in elevated CO2 levels did not avoid the sounds of the predator fish. However, the fish from the aquarium with a normal atmospheric CO2 pressure avoided the speaker end of the aquarium after the predator sounds were played. What are the independent and dependent variables in the investigation? So at the beginning, they're giving us a little bit of background. Carbon dioxide gas creates carbonic acid in ocean water. And we have some more background here in the second sentence. And then it says scientists investigated. So here we're going to have the variables. They investigated the effect of increased acidity on fish hearing. So it looks like what's changing is the acidity, and the effect of that change will be different levels of fish hearing. So the increased acidity is made by different pressures of CO2. So the different pressures of CO2 are going to be our independent variable. And the only answer choice that has CO2 pressure as the independent variable is answer choice A. But why is the dependent variable the position of the fish? You can also think of the dependent variable as what you're measuring in an experiment. And they are measuring, they're recording that fish's position. We can't actually tell if a fish can hear or not. It can't tell us. So we have to measure that in another way. And this way is by recording that position. So the position of the fish will be the dependent variable. And that depends on the CO2 pressure in which it was raised. Thanks for watching. You've got this.